Many parts of Central Asia may seem like paradise, a vast landscape of overwhelming beauty untouched by man. But this impression is deceptive. It's actually an intensely cultivated region, and human beings have left many traces. And sometimes their brutal interference with nature has had catastrophic consequences. Conflicts flare up frequently among farmers, among different ethnic groups, or at national frontiers. Almost always, access to water and arable land plays a decisive role. They're stealing our water even though we paid for it. You just can't trust these countries. We think our neighboring countries' policies are very harmful and dangerous.
Then we will have competition over water and possibly threats and possibly robust policies and the risk of crisis and conflict.
This is a question of war and peace. Sooner or later, this could lead to an attempt to solve the problem with violence. An old Antonov flies over the steppe. On board is Heinrich Tölken, head of climate and environmental diplomacy for the German Foreign Office. He acts as roving mediator for the water crisis in Central Asia, trying to sort out lingering conflicts between nations. Today, what we call Central Asia consists of 5 states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. They've been 5 separate countries since the Soviet Union in 1991. Tolkien has been in the region frequently over the last 3 years, but this trip is special. Its destination is the epicenter of the water crisis and one of the biggest environmental catastrophes ever perpetrated by mankind. This is Aralsk, formerly a fishing port on the Aral Sea. No scheduled flights land here, and only a few roads lead to this place. Very few people come here by choice. It's one of the most desolate places on Earth. The Aral Sea is divided between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The city of Aralsk lies to the north. But the Aral Sea is no longer one of the world's largest saltwater lakes, and Aralsk is no longer a port. What was once the harbor of Aralsk is now a vast plain of dried-up salt crusts, desert, and poisoned soil. The water level used to be 8 meters here. Now the shore of the dying Aral Sea is 50 kilometers away. When I see the empty harbor basin, I feel something like, what happened here is an act of brutality. It's a brutal transgression against nature with dramatic consequences. Ultimately, this is what you get for believing that you can just massively interfere with nature and change things without harmful consequences. You can see that people used to make their living from the shipping industry and fishing. The lake is gone, and what's left is social and economic devastation. What's happened in Aralsk could be what the future holds for a large part of Central Asia, since water resources are dwindling in many areas. Vast tracts are already coated by salt crusts, have become infertile, and are contaminated by tons of toxic chemicals and pesticides. And this is not the only nightmare. Tolkien knows from his experience as a diplomat that excessive destruction of the environment can lead to further crises. Well, I think that by now there's worldwide recognition of the fact that massive ecological change, like climate change, can lead to tensions, to new international problems. We need water, we need food, we depend on habitable land, and when all this becomes uncertain, as it is right now in Central Asia, when water becomes scarce, it can lead to tension between states, as we can clearly see between some countries in this region. The boundaries between the states of Central Asia are practically lines of demarcation. They show the antagonism between these former Soviet republics. Two boys lead Heinrich Weiss to the border between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, just beyond their village. Weiss is director of CAREC, an organization that attempts to establish broader environmental cooperation in Central Asia and tries to make these borders more permeable. If you look in front of you, you'll see that the border is partly mined. And a sign of the intensification of the border conflicts between the countries of Central Asia is that there really are landmines on the borders. Formerly, in Soviet times, they were just boundaries on paper. Now they're mined. When I see this valley and this straight border, this is a completely unnatural division in a landscape that belongs together ethnically, that belongs together in its biosphere. It's incomprehensible that this border exists, and why such a border is even needed. Enormous tensions, and almost always the same catalyst: access to water resources. So is there a threat of an open conflict over water? Here, people have been fighting over influence and power for centuries. But this was also where the Silk Road passed through. The trade was peaceful, and the region served as a cultural bridge between Europe and Asia. Up until recently, the lifelines were the rivers Sir Darya and Amu Darya, which are both around 2,500 kilometers long. They transport water from the glaciers of the Pamir Mountains and the Tian Shan over the wide plains to the Aral Sea. Experiments to transform the steppe into fertile land have been very successful. Too successful. Stalin and his successors recognized the region's agricultural potential. They built thousands of new irrigation canals and planted gigantic fields, especially for cotton, rice, and wheat. 6.5% of the world's cotton production comes from Central Asia, from over 7 million hectares of irrigated fields. In order to build reservoirs for irrigation, the Soviets built the world's largest retaining walls in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. They also built huge waterways, such as the Karakum Canal. It alone diverts a quarter of the Amu Darya's water and channels it to Ashgabat, 700 kilometers away. But the accomplishments of this agricultural industry were only one side of the coin. A large part of the water that was diverted into the rice and cotton fields was wasted. It simply evaporated or trickled away in the desert. And so the water catastrophe took its course. I believe that on a purely factual level, it was very well known what would happen if you diverted water for irrigation on such a massive scale and reduced the river's flow to the Aral Sea. But I also believe there was a bit of hubris, that you could control nature through technology, strength, horsepower, and concrete. They tried it. They built thousands of irrigation canals. They took the water away from the rivers and trusted that in the end, not too much would happen. But they also believed that if anything went wrong, they'd come up with another technological solution. This hasn't yet happened. All over the world, like here in Paris, politicians, environmentalists, and diplomats worry about the consequences of the technology craze.
J'ai visité l'Asie centrale déjà dans les années 60.
Even when I first visited Central Asia in the 1960s, I noticed how everything revolved around cotton. As an example, the cotton crop yield figures for the harvest stood at every village gate, or the entrances to the collective farms as big monuments in bricks and cast in concrete. Everyone was supposed to see them at all times to remind them of production targets. It was like an obsession, but also the cold authoritarian logic of the planned economy. The only things that counted were production numbers. Even on TV, it was always the same. Some shows with traditional music for variety, and then people with machines harvesting cotton. The whole region was completely obsessed.
C'était une obsession dans toute la région.
Those were better times, at least for the Aral Sea and the city of Aralsk. The fishing industry was booming. Beginning in the 1950s, less and less water flowed into the Aral Sea, and so its fate was sealed. Slowly at first, and then rapidly since the 1990s. Today, the huge lake has almost completely vanished from the face of the earth. Only 5% of its water remains. Instead, a salt desert is spreading. And today, Aralsk is a dying city. Salt dust and pesticide residue from industrial agriculture are making the people sick. The region is the world's worst case of desertification. In 1992, it was declared one of the world's greatest environmental disasters. The countries of Central Asia put on a show of nationalism and self-confidence, but there's clearly no blueprint for dealing with this ecological catastrophe. What's more, not one of the countries is being governed according to European democratic principles. The old local ex-Soviet power elite remained in charge after independence and still imposes authoritarian rule. There's no free press, and opposition is suppressed. As a kind of reflex, the country said, the Soviet Union is dead, and now there are only Kyrgyzstani, Kazakhstani, Tajik, and so on, and we can all do whatever we like. In this era, the countries were undergoing difficult times of shortages and redevelopment. But at the same time, they refused to cooperate. Everyone tried to tough it through on their own. But no one wins through non-cooperation. It's not even a zero-sum game. There's even less than zero below the line. Everyone loses.
C'est lose-lose situation.
In addition, Central Asia's neighborhood has been struggling from wars, sorrow, and injustice for decades. This is one of the worst crisis regions of the 20th and 21st century. China's troubled province, Xinjiang in the east, and Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan to the south. A spark could jump across quite easily. Take Tajikistan, which is a retreat area for radical combatants from Afghanistan. They bring weapons into the country and inspire local warlords to bloody insurrections. A savage civil war raged from 1992 to 1997 until Russia helped President Ramon stage a coup. He's still in power today. With its 1,400-kilometer border with Afghanistan, Tajikistan is considered a transit country for international drug trafficking. Kyrgyzstan is regularly shaken by uprisings and upheavals. More often than not, ethnic conflicts or protests against the government are only a superficial reason. The actual cause is the distribution of farmland. And in Central Asia, this is always connected to control over water. On July 20th, 2011, the United Nations Security Council in New York devoted an entire meeting to this particular issue. Unrest and wars caused by climate change, water shortages, and ecological catastrophes in Central Asia, as well as in many other places on the planet.
Maintenance of international peace and security, impact of climate change.
Thank you, Mr. President of the Security Council, Your Excellency, Mr. Marcos Stephen.
Until recently, these conflicts were short-lived and regional. But if they expand in the future, that could lead to conditions similar to those in neighboring Afghanistan.
Our prosperity, health, and safety are in peril. Time is not just moving ahead. Time is running out.
On ne peut plus analyser les perspectives de la sécurité.
Nowadays, security issues cannot be discussed without taking climate change into account. We have to adjust to consequences we hadn't previously thought of, no matter in which climatic region. The International Panel on Climate Change has made this very clear in its 2009 report.
Le rapport complémentaire en 2009, si je me souviens bien, a accentué cette prise de conscience.
The anatomy of one such conflict is apparent in Central Asia in microcosm. Abdrahim Kamalov had to give up his cornfield. It was supposed to nourish him and his family for a whole year, but now it's withered away. His apricot trees have also died. He cultivated them for 30 years, and now he's lost everything within 2 years. His neighbor up the canal is doing much better. Kamalov is sure his neighbor is using too much water, so much in fact that nothing is left for him. The farmers up the canal divert the water. They steal my water, and every time I get hold of one of them, I seize the water thief and beat him. It's the classic problem of those taking water upstream from those downstream. The same problem on a grand scale. In Central Asia, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are situated upstream. The region's main rivers, the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, have their sources here. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan are located on the river's lower courses. They're located downstream. This means that 90% of the water that reaches these countries has passed through the two countries upstream. One example, near the border in Kyrgyzstan is the Toktagul Dam on the Sirdarya River. The country uses it to exercise control over the water. This means downstream countries, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, only get as much water as Kyrgyzstan decides to release. On the way to Toktagul, the artificial lake, constructed in 1975 by the Soviets, is one of Central Asia's most important reservoirs. It contains about 20 billion square meters of water. Kyrgyzstan treats the dam like a state secret. Access is only granted with an armada of security personnel. The dam is 215 meters high and was originally meant to store water in autumn and spring to irrigate the gigantic cotton monocultures downstream. Since the end of the Soviet era, the dam's role has changed dramatically. Whereas in the past, the power generated by the turbines was only a beneficial side effect, nowadays, energy production has become the main goal. In the past, up until the 1980s, when there was drought in Uzbekistan, we released extra water, so much that the reservoir was just about empty. Those days are over. Now, we're autonomous sovereign republics with our own economies. And as fate would have it, the Toktogul Dam is located on our territory. We're very grateful for that. We use the power plant only in the interest of Kyrgyzstan.
Irrigation ou électricité? C'est ça la question.
Irrigation or electricity? That's the big question. Of course, irrigation was the main purpose in the cotton farming beginnings. But today, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan suffer from a lack of fossil fuel. They don't have the funds to buy it on the global market either. That's why these countries tend to produce more and more power with their dams, especially in winter.
Et pour l'électricité, il le faut pendant l'hiver. Donc une montée des rivières.
For those downstream, this means drought in the summer and floods in the winter. And of course, this leads to substantial conflicts.
Dans une période inutile, défavorable. Et donc là, il y a effectivement une confrontation.
Amirkhan Kenchimov is Kazakh and regularly negotiates water rights for his country. He feels constantly cheated by neighboring Kyrgyzstan. The water levels rise or fall depending on the amount of energy Kyrgyzstan needs. Nothing else matters to them. They don't care for our downstream problems. Whole towns are being flooded. Industrial plants are underwater. We try to protect ourselves with more and more storage basins, but that's not enough. There are indeed flood catastrophes in winter, with whole areas of land freezing over. Horses have frozen and perished agonizingly while the turbines of Toktogul Dam were running at full speed.
Avec une conséquence un peu perverse. On constate
the whole thing has perverse consequences. In recent years, the Uzbeks have built a lot of new reservoirs in order to store water in winter for the summer. This is how they try to become independent of the upstream country's water policies. The land is very flat in these parts of Uzbekistan, however, and the new reservoirs cannot be very deep. Additionally, the summers here are extremely hot due to the continental climate. This often leads to high evaporation and huge water loss. So energy production in winter not only leads to floods downstream, but also to gigantic evaporation losses in summer. Antiquated water wheels like this one can be found a lot throughout Central Asia. They represent another factor that leads to severe water losses. The state of the infrastructure is old, worn out, and leaking. Water just disappears into the ground unused, and this has a lot to do with central control being gone and maybe single villages or single businesses or even single farmers left on their own and without the support of central institutions. They have to maintain the irrigation ditch or weir on their own. And this is difficult. There's not enough money for investment, no thought of greater context, no regional aspect. Rustam Marumarov is traveling in South Kyrgyzstan. The EU commissioned him to survey water wastage throughout Central Asia. Here, traditional furrow irrigation is still being used. The farmer opens a primitive floodgate to lead the water onto the fields.
In general, we have bad practice in this approach, I mean in furrow irrigation. In total, for the whole system, which comprise, the off-farm, on-farm irrigation system and also furrow, in total it amounts to 70%. 30% only goes to the plants.
Scientists commissioned by the German government are flying to the Pamir glaciers in order to find further catalysts for the water crisis. The scientists are especially interested in the state of Central Asia's water reserves. Those are mainly stored in the Pamir glaciers and neighboring Tian Shan.
You are happy with 3 profiles, but you are also happy with 30 profiles. But we must be happy with 1 station. Yeah, that's clear.
There will be snow during the winter season.
No, but we have.
Leading the exhibition is Thilo Schörne from the German Research Center for Geosciences in Potsdam. The survey will lead to a prognosis of the deterioration of the glaciers and thereby the water supply. 90% of the water in the main rivers is meltwater from these glaciers. There's also very little information about the amount of precipitation every winter, a vital piece of information for forecasting the amount of meltwater and for a fair distribution of the water. For this reason, the scientists will construct a research and measuring station, which will automatically transmit climate and weather data to the valley. Heinrich Tölken has boarded the Antonov once more. He's returning to civilization. A last glance back at the remainder of the Aral Sea and its treacherous beauty, which hints at the paradise that's been lost. Almaty, Kazakhstan's great industrial metropolis. Tölken has had a conference organized here. Its topic, the fair distribution of water in Central Asia. Every country has sent delegates. There are also many Europeans, such as the German ambassador to Kazakhstan, Guido Herz. It's obvious there's a lack of political will. Well, we can hold as many workshops as we like. If there's a lack of motivation to work together all the way up to the top, I remain rather skeptical regarding the prospects for success. The Europeans would like to export their own success story to Central Asia. The EU developed from the European Coal and Steel Community, which coordinated these common resources. The common insight was that a resource, whether steel or water, does not necessarily have to be a reason for conflict. It can even connect different countries. Some feel patronized and think the Europeans perceive them as clueless. Perhaps some things may be new to us, but our hydro specialists are first-rate experts. If you start teaching them that 2 and 2 equals 4, you hear complaints that they're being lectured to. Heated debates and mutual accusations. An agreement seems impossible, even though there was a solution in the past. If there's a surplus of water in one region and a surplus of energy in another region, it's obvious that one can communicate and maybe even make a trade. And this is what happened here. Those upstream, that is Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where the water originates, had a surplus of water. And those downstream, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, coincidentally had gas and oil. This is where you could do business and make an exchange. Kyrgyz and Tajiks didn't have to produce power in their hydroelectric plants in winter, since there was enough gas and oil for heating, and those living downstream had enough water for their fields in summer. The deal, however, only worked in the Soviet era. In the past, it was centrally decreed and controlled by Moscow. Today, the various countries are all separate parties and have to reach an agreement. And so the feeling arises that the upstream countries want to hold back water, or rather try to exert control over water. And the downstream countries don't like that. It's then easy to stop providing natural gas, as happened between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. And it's always difficult to get out of this situation when you've already built up high walls and said, I won't do this or that anymore. Kazakhstan is even ready to pay for water. But this always goes wrong. Take 2008, for example. Kyrgyzstan only supplied us with 70% of the water we agreed on. They didn't even give us what was ours. Kyrgyzstan only does whatever they want. They don't even give us what we paid for. Upstream country Tajikistan suspects political calculation may lie behind the accusations. We see the obvious goal of thwarting Tajikistan's progress. And to secure the energy markets in Afghanistan and Pakistan for themselves. Tajikistan is a poor country and suffers from energy shortages. In the summer months, energy consumption is minimal, but in winter, people heat with electricity. Its power generation capacities are far from sufficient. Very often, the power fails for hours. Many Tajiks freeze in their homes. This is why an old Soviet project has been revived, the construction of the world's highest dam. This further heated up the debate between the governments of Central Asia. In particular, downstream country Uzbekistan is against the Rogun hydroelectric power project since it fears that upstream country Tajikistan will gain even more control over water. The Tajiks are fighting back. We have a huge demand for electrical energy. We have to develop our economy. What does it mean we shouldn't build the Rogun power plant? How could we not do so? I think that whoever questions the dam has purely political motives. Indeed, Uzbekistan blatantly threatens consequences if the Rogun Dam is ever built. On September 7, 2012, Uzbek President Islom Karimov held a news conference. Not just a confrontation, it can lead us to wars. That's why when we talk about transborder rivers, we should observe international agreements, observe the decisions of the international community. It seems as though Tajikistan really is taking the risk of confrontation and continuing to build the Rogun Dam. Proudly, the chief engineer shows us how much they've progressed. All the buildings and the main facilities are here on the left bank. This is where we're constructing the drainage channel. From there, the water will flow into the Rogun power plant. Look, there, down the slope, everything is prepared. The dam will be 1.5 kilometers wide at its foot. This will all disappear under a massive mountain. "40% of the construction is reported to be completed. And indeed, the dimensions are breathtaking. The underground tunnels are several kilometers long. Only rarely are Western camera teams allowed to shoot here. The site engineer is clearly nervous while the cameras record his inner sanctum, the giant turbine room, reminiscent of a science fiction film. In a war, Tajikistan wouldn't stand a chance against the Uzbeks. But encouragement makes them bold. Former European Parliament member Struan Stevenson unconditionally supports the dam, even though this has never reflected the official EU policy.
And for people to be questioning whether this project should be allowed to go ahead seems to me an absolute, disgraceful nonsense, and it's something that we have to come to terms with in Europe. This is a project that is absolutely necessary. We are standing in Tajikistan and Dushanbe, where they provide the gateway between the volatile areas of the world like Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they are guarding Europe from the influx of drugs, human traffickers, terrorists. We must help them. We must recognize the value of this country and stop criticizing some of the hydropower projects that they're planning. And I'm here for that purpose as a member of the European Parliament.
Tajikistan believes it cannot give up on Rogun, but Uzbekistan is threatening military conflict if the dam is built, a political dead end. In 2010, the World Bank stepped in to de-escalate the situation. Saroj Kumar Jha is Regional Director for Central Asia and responsible for a study that objectively investigates the dam's usefulness and feasibility.
Now, whether this project is feasible or not, whether this project will have adverse impact on the downstream countries, whether it will have any environmental and social impact, whether this project actually makes sense from an economic perspective, or there are other options for Tajikistan to meet its energy demand. These are the questions that had to be answered in a modern context where you apply the international standards. So that's why the World Bank, given our expertise and our experience with the basins and doing such large hydropower projects around the world.
Critics such as dam expert and former World Bank counselor Anatoly Krutov believe the World Bank's involvement will trigger much more severe problems, and the danger of a war over water has greatly intensified.
If somebody would ask me, should the bank be involved in the construction, or let's say, in pushing forward, let's say, the idea of the Rogun Dam, I would say no. Why? Because of the consequences. They are on the edge. What I mean? So if they would say yes for the Rogun Dam, means they will lose Uzbekistan and, I don't know, maybe Turkmenistan. I don't know how Kazakhstan would react on that. So it's very hard even to predict.
A security conference will take place at the OSCE headquarters in Vienna in mid-2014. Its topic, water conflicts. OSCE Secretary General Lamberto Zanier can barely comprehend the World Bank study's format and orientation.
The study of the World Bank is primarily a technical study, which, however, has a political impact and is likely to have even higher political impact over time as decisions will be taken. So we will have to deal with that from a security perspective. As I say, that's a little bit the angle from which we are coming as the international community.
Indeed, when the study was published, it was a bombshell, particularly because its conclusion is unambiguous.
The study done by the consultants, we hired two international consultants, consortium of consultants, one to do the techno-economic feasibility study, the other to do the environmental and social impact study. Now, these studies done by the consultants have shown that from a techno-economic and environmental and social perspective, it is possible to build this dam safely, and it would not have any safety concerns. It is possible to come up with plans which would essentially mitigate any possible risks that you may have in such large projects.
However, the critics' fears seem to be confirmed. The Uzbek government reacted with aggressive dismissal, albeit only on a government-issued website. Further statements or interviews are being declined. Taking into account the extreme water scarcity in Central Asia, this mechanism can be converted into an explicit tool of political pressure on downstream countries, provoking escalation of confrontation and growth of conflict potential in the region. Millions of people are prepared for any actions to access potable and irrigation water for their own and their children. It's frightening even to picture the consequences. Still, the World Bank refuses to admit a connection between the verbal escalation and its own study.
So it's been a very transparent and inclusive process, and our hope is that a credible process like this, which is inclusive, which is transparent, does have the potential to bring parties together and inspire trust and confidence in terms of initiating a dialogue and then coming to a decision.
Quite on the contrary, the Uzbek side. Uzbekistan hoped the World Bank would adhere to the basic principles of good faith, transparency, objectivity, and the best international practice in its activity on the Rogun hydropower plant project. We have to state with much regret that our hope was in vain. That the study, and thus the World Bank's attempt to mediate, have failed came as no surprise to Anatoly Krutov.
Just a simple question. Did they discuss it with Uzbekistan? They would say yes, and I would say no. Why? They were saying, hey, the bank financed that. It's a bank story. Tajikistan financed that. It's a Tajikistan story. It's not ours. We did not participate in that. We do not know how and what is the conclusion. We do not trust this conclusion. They did not participate.
Privately, insiders say that if a war really does break out, it would be the first one caused by a United Nations body, namely the World Bank. Power production versus irrigation. Upstreamers versus downstreamers. Tajiks versus Uzbeks. Heinrich Tolkien wants to prove that solutions can be found. He's launched a kind of lab test in the border regions of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. At the Isfara River, a tributary of the Sir Darya. Here, too, arguing over water was a daily routine. The point is to show by way of a prototype, an example, that it's possible to enter into an agreement. What works on a small scale can also work between the big states. Prospects of success are unlikely when you start on the big level without involving the local population. The population needs to join in, needs to understand and accept that it's to the benefit of both parties, and even three, when there are clear understandings and no conflict.
Und an diesem Stauwehr wird tatsächlich ein größerer Teil der Isfara abgeleitet in diesen Zuleitungskanal in den Stausee, die in die Isfara gehen und die Wassermengen, die hier...
In order to reconcile the parties, trust was necessary. And Rustam Marumarov works on that on a practical level, in the villages, setting up water metering stations. Everyone who's anyone in the village has come, a sign of gratitude because the metering stations have indeed brought peace. For the first time, they allow measurement of the exact amount of water that flows through the various canals and onto the fields. Only this way can the water be evenly distributed. Such stations are located in many places. Local technicians come by regularly and read the water levels. They feed the data into a central computer, and this is where the responsible hydro engineer can verify if everyone has received their fair share of water. However, technical installations are useless in the long run without an efficient and transparent administration. The Water Alliance of Central Asia sets up water committees all over the country. These are democratically elected bodies, supported and counseled by the NGO. Elmira Yoldasheva is the head of the aid organization. She hopes to give the population more power with the water committees, at the same time fighting non-transparency and corruption.
Institutional development is like when you are working with them, explaining their role, they know their role, they know how to work with people, and they understand that they are providers of the service, not the owners of water.
Chinara Jankilova, a local nurse, was elected the village's head of the water committee. Like all other villagers, she too at first had to learn how a communal water administration works. We had to explain the importance of an organized water supply, to give women a voice, and to get the residents accustomed to paying for their water. In the Soviet era, water was a gift from Moscow. Water pipes and their maintenance were centrally organized and paid for. Today, the village is on its own, and maintaining the pipes is expensive. This is why collecting the water fees is a job for the boss. However, better than any arguments is the new water main that will be laid in this trench. It's proof that such things are possible without development aid, by their own efforts. The Water Committee's job is so successful that the municipality can provide every house and every field with a well-functioning modern water system, which distributes the water reliably and fairly. Hinrich Tolkien is on his way back to Europe. He's leaving an area where small achievements bring hope, but where national governments seem unapproachable for diplomatic attempts at mediation. A shortage of water is a very acute shortage that can very quickly cause pain for the economy as well as the people, and that can quickly lead to escalating crises. And as long as the governments won't stop thinking nationally, the problems won't be solved. We really try to do good work here. But this will all be a waste of time if the governments of Central Asia say, well, you look at our problems from a safe distance and you try to explain the world at conferences. But my country's society is different. This is about our survival. Electric power may be important to the others, but our farmers' lives are just as important. And we have a right to this water and to do things our way.
I think it's urgent. I think we need to move fast. We need to move fast. Developments are taking place. Afghanistan, we see their developments on a daily basis. We need stability in the whole region. So we are present. The tools are there. We need to start using them, and we need to talk to governments.
Since the Rogun power plant study has been published, deathly silence prevails in Central Asia. Distrust between governments is greater than ever. Neither one wants to take a side politically, let alone make a statement in front of the press. But some observers see that as an accomplishment. It could be worse. The research station in Pamir, 4,500 meters above sea level, takes form. The scientists install the last automatic sensors, such as for snow levels and kinds of snow, temperature, wind and precipitation. The data will be available daily through the internet and make it possible for the first time to forecast water levels and the amount of water in the Central Asian rivers for months in advance, an important prerequisite for a fair distribution of water. After 10 days of hard labor, the station is ready. The teamwork of Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Swiss, and Germans went perfectly fine. Thilo Schörne, who leads the expedition, takes this as a good sign. The scientists who are here have a scientific goal. They worked together in the past, before those borders were artificially created again. So there are no reserves or conflicting issues where you could say that something went off in the wrong direction. This is at least one bright spot in an area where normally dictators and nationalism dominate the political agenda.